record. So FARs are not that exciting. They are quite monotonous. They are very necessary though. So we just kind of have to go through them and talk about what they mean. And it's probably to your benefit to know at least the major ones, which I'll make sure I tell you which ones those are. However, you have to know where to find everything, because in the FAA, not necessarily the FAA or the FAA written test, but the FAA practical test, you'll have to know where these rules are, where they exist. So it's good to have a good understanding of what the different sections are, kind of how the regulations are ordered, and at least a general understanding of where to find these regulations. So maybe my keyboard won't work. All right. So parts to the FARs. So first of all, the FARs, or Federal Aviation Regulations, are part of the Code of Federal Regulations, which are known as the CFR. And you can look these up online. There's an electronic database, the ECFRs, and you can go there. And inside the ECFRs, the Federal Aviation Regulations are specifically under Title 14. So Title 14 is Aeronautics and Space, and that's where all these rules come from. So in case you're curious. There are a few parts, not all the parts are applicable to what private pilots need to know. A lot of them, there's airport regulations, there's regulations for gliders, balloons, everything's in there. So the parts that you want to focus on are going to be Part 1, Part 21, Part 39, 43, 61, 71, and 91. There's also parts at the back, which are not on the ECFR website, but in the FAR book, which are called NTSB regulations. So we'll talk about what all those are and what they mean. As far as remote pilots are concerned, if that's a thing that you want to get into, you don't need to know all the same regulations as a private pilot, but you do need to know at least Part 61, 91, and 107. 107 is the big one there. And so we'll talk about what all those mean. Don't worry yet. So what are in the FARs? Everything that governs aviation is in the FARs. They're really meant as a resource. There's nothing in there that isn't necessary. There's a reason behind every rule. Rules get added because of crashes and because of malfunctions and other reasons. So all the rules in there are meant to keep pilots safe, and they're all necessary. So it's good to know what they are, and it's good to understand why they exist. They are split into different parts. Like, for example, Part 61 covers what it means to be a pilot, what the certification process is, what's required. Part 91 is the general rules and operating procedures. And then there's other FARs which are dedicated to maintenance, stuff like flight schools, airports, parachuting, everything's in there. So let's start by talking about Part 61. So Part 61 is dedicated entirely to the certification of pilots. It contains standards for student pilots, recreational pilots, private pilots, commercial, list goes on. So every type of rating that you can get basically resides in Part 61. Specifically, the part we're going to be looking at is subpart E of Part 61, which talks about private pilots. So inside that, we have specific regulations under Part 61, which we denote by like 61 and then .103. So that's regulation 103 in Part 61. Like 61.103 details what you have to generally be eligible for. So you have to be at least 17 years of age in order to get your private pilot license. There's other parts as well, but we will get to all of those shortly. Part 107, this is related entirely to drones. It was added more recently than all the other sections. If you're interested in getting your commercial drone license, this is what you're going to be studying instead of most of these other regulations. But it's important to know if just want to be curious about what it takes to fly a drone. It has different subparts, like Part 61, that determine eligibility, what you need to know, and everything pertaining to getting a rating as a Part 107 commercial drone pilot. So Part 91, this is going to be one of the most referenced sections that we're going to talk about. It's the most important. It has all of the general operating rules, and it has some of the most important regulations when it comes to flying. These apply to all pilots, so it's very important to know what's in Part 91. For example, we have Part 91.3, which is basically laying out the ground rules for what a pilot can do. So a pilot is in command, the pilot in command of an aircraft is responsible for and is the final authority to an aircraft. In an in-flight emergency, the pilot in command can deviate from any rules in this section, or really in the entirety of the section. And they might be required to submit a report upon deviating, depending on the scenario. But 91.3 is one of those big ones that it's probably good to have memorized, at least to an extent of knowing what parts A, B, and C are and what that means. All right, Part 43. We're not going to really talk about Part 43, but you can look it up later. Basically, it talks about preventative maintenance and maintenance specific regulations. So there is one particular one that you should know. It's 43.9, Section A, 1 through 3, and it kind of talks about like work that has to be logged when you perform preventative maintenance, like the date you complete the work, what work was done, and you also have to list the person performing the work if it's not a person that you specified in a different part. So all right, this begins the fun part of going through the regulations. So we're going to basically go through each regulation one by one. We're going to talk about it. If you have any questions about what the regulation means or anything else, just let me know and we'll stop and we'll talk about it. So, all right, Part 1, 1.1. Part 1 is dedicated to abbreviations and definitions. So if you go to Title 14, Section 1.1, and you look at what it says, it's going to be all about definitions and abbreviations. And you'll see a lot of different things in there. It's not about memorizing what all of them mean. Don't try and memorize what they mean because you won't be able to do it all. But as you become more and more well-versed with the language of aviation, a lot of them will come more naturally. So don't try and sit down and memorize them, but just know what's in there and just kind of be familiar with the kind of stuff that it lays out. Section 1.2. This section is kind of like an add-on to Section 1.1. It has more abbreviations and definitions, and it has some important ones like VX and VY, or VOR or MSL. As it turns out, the aviation world, a lot like the engineering world, has a lot of acronyms, and so sometimes you don't need to know what they mean, like VOR. A lot of people don't necessarily need to know that it means very high omnidirectional range because that doesn't make any sense. We just refer to them as VORs, and as long as you know what a VOR does, it doesn't matter necessarily what the definition is. But these are terminologies that you should be familiar with. So as long as you know what the acronym means, you'll probably be fine. You don't necessarily need to know what it stands for, unless it's stuff like mean sea level. Then, yeah, of course, MSL is equivalent to mean sea level. That's helpful in determining what it means. So. All right, move on from Section 1. Now we're going to talk about Section 21.181. So this section talks about standard airworthiness and different types of airworthiness categories. This is probably going to be referenced in some sort of question about how long a standard airworthiness certificate is, or what a standard airworthiness certificate is. They really, what the whole point of this section is that standard airworthiness certificates don't expire as long as maintenance is kept up with on the aircraft. So if there's airworthiness directives, make sure that those are all up to date. Make sure that any 100 hours, all those things are kept up to date. And as long as that's true and you've kept up on the maintenance of your aircraft, then your airworthiness certificate will not expire on the aircraft. You won't have to renew that, which is kind of nice. All right, section 39.3. This section basically talks about the FAA's airworthiness directives. And an airworthiness directive is sometimes abbreviated as an AD. And basically these are mandatory rules, basically like a recall on a car, except this is like legally enforceable. So if a part is found to be faulty in an aircraft, so let's say a new aircraft is certified, it's released, and you own that aircraft, and they later find out that a wheel strut has bad machining on it, and it affects all these aircraft. The FAA will put out an airworthiness directive about this, and sometimes it's enforceable like immediately if it's a very serious problem. Otherwise, it'll be like enforceable at the next 100-hour or annual or whatever. The airworthiness directive will specify that. And so when you get an airworthiness directive for your aircraft, when you take it into your mechanic, then they'll make sure that airworthiness directive is applied, and make sure that you're complying with the FAA's guidance on that airworthiness directive. The big idea here is that you have to comply with airworthiness directives whenever the airworthiness directive is good for. All right, we're going to get into the first of our big sections here now. So part 61, this is all about licensing. So part 61.3, no person may serve as a required pilot flight crew member of a civil aircraft in the United States unless that person has a pilot certificate, a photo ID, and a medical certificate. So these are the three things that you need when you go flying. If you do not have these, you cannot fly. So a pilot certificate, obviously, is your pilot's license. So it's a piece of plastic, usually, sometimes paper if it's temporary, and you have to carry that around with you when you're flying. Photo ID, this can be a driver's license, or it can be any other type of government-issued photo ID, but you need to have something that proves, because a pilot's license doesn't have a photo on it. So you need to have something that proves that you are the person who's eligible to operate that pilot certificate. And you also need a medical certificate. This is issued by an FAA medical examiner, and there's a few different types of medical certificates, but we'll get into those later in the regulations. All right, 61.15. Any federal or state violation regarding illegal drugs is grounds for denial up to a year or suspension/revocation of any certificate, rating, etc. Committing an act prohibited by 91.17 Section A or 91.19 Section A of this chapter is grounds for denial up to a year or suspension or revocation of any certificate, rating, etc. So the general gist of this is that if you commit any type of drug or a prohibited act offense, the FAA can take your certificate away from you. And yeah, that's just basically laying the ground rules for that. And we'll get into what that means later, because this is defined more in some of the other sections. Part 61.23. So you must hold at least a third-class medical certificate. And when exercising the privileges of private pilot certificate, recreational private certificate, or a student pilot certificate, except when operating under the conditions and limitations set forth in 61.113 Section I. And the third class is good for 60 months after the date shown on a certificate, unless you're under 40, and it's good for 24 months after the date shown on the certificate if you're older than 40. So this regulation is an important one. I kind of took away the other parts of it, which talk about first class and second class medicals. What you need to know, because most likely if you are looking to get your private pilot's license, you'll have to go get a medical examination, and you have to get at least a third class medical for at least your first time. After that, there's a few options, such as basic med, but third class is kind of like the lowest certificate you can get. So when you get your third class medical, you have to have that with you when you're flying, like we talked about before. And this third class medical is good for 60 months as long as you're under 40, which I'm going to assume that everybody here is under 40. So that's kind of what you need to know. However, there will probably be a question on the written exam about how long medicals are good for, and they'll give you dates that are close to 40. So it's good to know that it's good for 60 months after the date shown if you're under 40, and 24 months if you're over 40. And just so you know, everything is measured in months, so years are not part of this. So don't say it's good for 2 years or whatever. It's always in months. All right, part 6131. You are required to obtain a type rating if acting as PIC of a large aircraft greater than 12,500 pounds gross weight, a turbojet airplane, or any other aircraft specified by the administrator. You must receive and log ground flight training, plus receive an endorsement in your logbook before operating a complex aircraft, high-performance aircraft, pressurized aircraft, or a tailwheel aircraft. So this regulation mostly applies to people that have already gotten their private pilot's license. But once you get your private pilot's license, you have a few options. So if you want to fly bigger aircraft, or you want to fly a special type of aircraft like a tailwheel airplane, then you have to get special instruction. Unless you were originally certified in, like, let's say you took your initial check ride in a tailwheel airplane, then this doesn't apply to you necessarily. But for all intents and purposes, we'll kind of talk about this like you never flown any of these types. So the first thing it's talking about here is a type rating. So these are for larger aircraft. Normally, when you fly your check ride, at least for smaller aircraft that are not part of these bullet points, you'll be certified in that aircraft class. So if you're certified in a Cessna 172, you'll be able to fly basically any single engine aircraft as long as it's not a complex high pressure or high performance pressurized or tailwheel. In fact, on the certificate it says, like for me, it says I'm certified for single engine land performance aircraft. So basically any single engine lightweight aircraft I can fly. Now, when you get into the big boys, large aircraft greater than 12,500 pounds or a turbojet, you are required to get a specific rating and training in those aircraft in order to fly them, in addition to having a commercial license or a flight instructor license or whatever. So probably not something that you'll run into, at least in regulations wise, but you'll probably see questions on this stuff. So, and the big thing here is that, at least for these additional ratings, these complex high performance pressurized tailwheel that are not part of the type rating thing, is that you have to log ground and flight training and get an endorsement from a certified flight instructor before you can operate those. All right, part 6156. As a pilot, you must complete a flight review every 24 months, which includes 1 hour of flight training and 1 hour of ground training. A practical test for any additional ratings counts for a flight review. So a pilot's license is technically good forever, unless you get it revoked by the FAA or you, for some reason, give it up. Whatever that may be, a pilot's license is good forever. It has no expiration date. So the caveat to that is that in order to exercise the privilege of a pilot's license, you must complete a flight review every 24 months in order for it to be valid. This has to be logged in a logbook, and it has to be done by a certified instructor. So this flight review includes an hour of flight training, So this means that you go up with an instructor, you fly around and basically demonstrate proficiency. It also includes 1 hour of ground training. This ground training can be done by either a certified flight instructor. Usually it's done by the same person in the same day, or it can be done by any ground rated instructor. So an advanced ground instructor or any other type of ground instructor can do that training and sign off on it. If you take a practical test within your 24 months before you have to take a flight review, that counts as a flight review and you don't need to do it. There is another option, which is not necessarily mentioned here, but the FAA has what's called a WINGS program. And this WINGS program also counts for some of the stuff needed for your flight review. You can look it up. If you just search FAA WINGS, it'll come up and you can kind of look into what that is. But what you need to know here is that every 24 months you must complete a flight review. All right, part 6157. To act as PIC of an aircraft carrying passengers, you must within the past 90 days have made 3 takeoffs and landings. And to act as PIC of an aircraft carrying passengers at night, you must within the past 90 days made at least 3 takeoffs and landings at night. And it must be 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. And they have to be to a full stop. So these 2 regulations, this is kind of another caveat to the pilot's license thing. In addition to a biennial flight review, you also have to do these takeoffs and landings if you're carrying passengers. Now, if you're not carrying passengers, you can technically go fly anytime you want during the 2 years of your biennial flight review, which I guess the FAA assumes that if you're up there flying alone, something goes wrong because you didn't train enough that, at least you're the only one in the airplane. So in order to carry passengers, you have to do these 3 takeoffs and landings within the past 90 days. Now, if you do your night landings, those night landings also count for day landings. So if you do all your takeoffs and landings at night, those also count during the day. But the idea here is that you have to do these 3 takeoffs and landings before you carry passengers within the past 90 days. All right, part 6160. If you change permanent addresses, you must notify the FAA in writing of the address within 30 days to exercise privileges of the certificates. I guess this is kind of another caveat. However, a lot of people don't necessarily have trouble with this. If you move, you have to notify the FAA of where your address is. This is just so they can get in touch with you in case, I don't know, they need you to do paperwork or something. I don't know. If you're, say, a college student and you technically are like in a dorm or something, or you're not at a permanent residence, you can set your permanent, like for me, I have my permanent residence set at my house downstate. I didn't move it up here and I didn't tell the FAA about that because it's not technically my permanent address. But if you move houses, you have to notify the FAA within 30 days of your new address in order to use your pilot certificate. Part 6169. No person may act as a pilot in command for towing a glider or unpowered ultralight vehicle unless that person holds a private, commercial, or airline transport pilot certificate with the category rating for powered aircraft, has logged at least 100 hours in the aircraft category, class, type used to tow, has a logbook endorsement from an authorized instructor certifying that the person has received necessary ground instruction, has logged 3 flights as sole manipulator of the controls of an aircraft towing a glider, accompanied by a pilot who meets the requirements in section C and D of this section, has received a logbook endorsement from the pilot accompanying the manipulator, and alternatively, you may as well make 3 flights as PIC of a glider while being towed by an aircraft. This is kind of a more like obscure rule. However, it's part of the stuff you should know. They'll probably maybe ask you a question. It's all random, so you don't really know, but I've seen questions like this pop up. So basically, the idea here is that in order to tow people up in a glider, you don't need any special commercial rating or anything. You can just use a private pilot certificate. However, you have to fulfill all the requirements listed here, including your 100 hours in the aircraft they're using to tow. You have to go up with an instructor, and basically the instructor just makes sure that you can do this safely. And you have to do the 3 tows or flights with that instructor in order to be signed off as you're able to do this solo. So, and there's a special logbook endorsement for this as well. So as long as you fulfill all these requirements, you can go up and you can tow gliders. So yeah, if you have a glider license as well, this is kind of the caveat to this. If you just go up and do 3 flights while being towed, you also fulfill these requirements. All right, part 6195. A student pilot may not operate an aircraft on a solo flight in Class Bravo airspace unless the student has received ground flight training on Class Bravo airspace and in the specific Class Bravo to which the student will solo. The logbook has been endorsed by that instructor and is dated within the previous 90 days. So we haven't really talked about what Class Bravo airspace is or any other classes of airspace. But just so that you know kind of what this is, these are around the busiest airports in the United States. So this is Chicago, this is Atlanta, this is, all the big airports. So these are all designated as what we call Class Bravo airports. And what that means is that in order to operate an aircraft in there, you minimally need a private pilot's license, unless as a student pilot you fulfill these requirements. Not that I would recommend flying to a Class Bravo airport as a student pilot anyway, but you can do it barring that your flight instructor has given you ground and flight training on that airspace, and you've gotten a logbook endorsement that says that you are eligible to fly within that Class Bravo airspace during the specific time or circumstances. So it's kind of a technical detail to what student pilots are able to do. Part 61-113. Except as provided in paragraphs B through H of this section, a holder of a private pilot certificate may not act as PIC of an aircraft carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire, or act as PIC of an aircraft for compensation or hire. Common exception is that a private pilot may not pay less than the prorated share of operating expenses of an aircraft, except for certain expenses. So the main idea of this is, and there are more caveats to this rule, is that as a private pilot, you cannot make money from flying. You have to have at least a commercial pilot certificate for that to happen. And basically, there are a list of caveats to this rule. We're not going to go through them all, but one of the common ones is that you can get some money up to the prorated share. So that is the proportional share. So if you and a buddy go flying, you could split half cost, and you can only split that cost amongst things like fuel, oil, airport expenditures, rental fees. So it's kind of a limitation, but I guarantee you'll get asked a question on this some point where they talk about what can you do as a private pilot, and one of the things you can't do is you cannot make money carrying passengers or property. I guess my mouse won't work again. There we go. All right, section 71, part 71. This is defining what Class Echo airspace is. Class Echo airspace is basically everything that's not something. So if something is not labeled as a specific type of airspace, it's Class Echo. This is kind of what we refer to as everywhere airspace. So this is going to define that further, but just as a general rule of thumb. So Class Echo airspace is defined as the airspace overlying waters within 12 nautical miles of the coast of the 48 contiguous United States and Alaska, extending from 14,500 feet mean sea level up to, but not including, 18,000 feet mean sea level. and the airspace above flight level 600 or 60,000 feet, except the Alaska Peninsula west of longitude 160 degrees, whatever, and the airspace below 1,500 feet above the Earth's surface. Airports designated a Class Echo, which are either Class Echo to the surface, or they start at 700 feet or 1,200 feet above the surface. Also, Federal Airways, which start at 1,200 feet. So there's kind of a lot here. But until we get to reading charts and maps, I'm not going to get really into how to read these on a chart. Just know that any airspace that is above flight level 60 or flight level 600, 60,000 feet is considered Class Echo airspace. And any airports, some airports are designated as Class Echo airspace. Those are what we call Class E to the surface airports. As it turns out, the Houghton Airport is a Class E to the surface airport. Class E is also technically a controlled airspace, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't mean it's necessarily controlled by a person, but it's what we call controlled airspace. It's kind of a technical definition. And also Class Echo can start at airports that are normally what we call Class Gulf airports. And at those airports, it will start at either 700 or 1,200 feet, depending on the airport. All Federal Airways are also Class Echo. But we'll kind of talk more about that when we get to charts and maps. So now we're going to move into part 91. So 91.3, or actually I should say this, part 91 is all the general operating rules. So we're going to talk about what it means and what you can and can't do as a pilot. And this applies to all pilots, not just private pilots. All right, so part 91.3. The pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. In an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency, and each pilot in command who deviates from a rule under paragraph B of this section shall, upon the request of the administrator, send a written report of that deviation to the administrator. So basically, this rule says that everything in the book goes out the window when you need to respond to an emergency. When you declare an emergency in flight, you basically get unlimited priority to the extent required to meet that emergency. So if you have an engine out and you need to land at a Class Bravo airport and you declare an emergency, you can do whatever you need to get that aircraft on the ground. They will push other aircraft, large aircraft around for you just so you can get down to the ground. So any aircraft in distress will get priority above every other aircraft. Now, the caveat to this and the caveat to breaking rules is that you might have to submit a report kind of explaining why you did what you did, stuff like that. And that's only if it's requested. It's not always requested. So if you have to make an engine out landing or a low fuel emergency landing at an airport, the airport or the FAA might not ask you to submit a report. But if you do, you're required to send a written report to the administrator. All right, part 91.7. No person may operate a civil aircraft unless it is in an airworthy condition. The pilot in command of the aircraft is responsible for determining whether that aircraft is in a condition safe for flight. The pilot in command shall discontinue the flight when an unairworthy mechanical, electrical, or structural condition occurs. So this rule basically is kind of getting at the idea of a pre-flight check. So before you go fly, you are basically required to do a pre-flight check of the aircraft to make sure that it's in a safe condition for flying. My guess is if you see a question on this, it'll be phrased something like, who is responsible for determining if an aircraft is safe for flight? The answer to that is the pilot in command. It's not the mechanic. It's not the owner. It's the pilot in command of that aircraft who is going to be flying it that has to determine whether it's safe for flight. So before you go flying, you have to do a walk around. You have to check all the different things, the oil, the engine, the tires, the mechanics of the ailerons, the rudder, everything. And the other part to this is kind of if something goes wrong while you're flying, that would make it become unairworthy. So let's say you lose electrical power, that you should land as soon as possible. Part 91.9. Except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no person may operate a civil aircraft without complying with the operating limitations specified in the approved airplane or rotorcraft flight manual, markings and placards, or otherwise prescribed by the certificating authority of the county of registry. Also, for which an airplane rotorcraft flight manual is required by 21.5 of this chapter, unless there is available in the aircraft a current approved airplane or rotorcraft flight manual or the manual provided for in section 121.141B. So this is kind of getting at the idea that you are required to have a flight manual when you're flying, and you're also required to have certain placards and markings on the aircraft. So, for instance, if something is not working in the aircraft and it's not part of the aircraft's like minimum equipment list, things that are needed to go flying, and we'll kind of talk about what that means later, you have to placard that as inoperative so that people know that it's not working. You're also required when you go flying to have an aircraft flight manual inside the aircraft. These flight manuals all have things like emergency checklists, has like schematics of how the oil system, electrical system, anything in the aircraft, circuit breakers, they're all in there, and you have to have that available for reference. Part 91.15. No pilot in command of a civil aircraft may allow any object to be dropped from that aircraft in flight that creates a hazard to persons or property. However, this section does not prohibit the dropping of any object if reasonable precautions are taken to avoid injury or damage to persons or property. So yeah, this one's kind of self-explanatory, but basically you can't drop stuff out of your airplane unless you make sure that whatever you're dropping isn't going to hurt somebody. 91.17. No person may act or attempt to act as a crew member of a civil aircraft within 8 hours after the consumption of alcoholic beverage, while under the influence of alcohol, while using any drug that affects the person's faculties in any way contrary to safety, or while having an alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater in the blood or breath specimen. Alcohol concentration means grams of alcohol per deciliter of blood or grams of alcohol per 210 liters of breath. Except in emergency, no pilot of a civil aircraft may allow a person who appears to be intoxicated or who demonstrates by manner or physical indications that the individual is under the influence of drugs, except a medical patient under proper care, to be carried in that aircraft. So this one kind of comes with a mnemonic pilots have used for a while, and that is 8 to 10 hours bottle to throttle. So basically you have to have at least 8 hours after the consumption of alcohol before you go flying, and you can't fly with an alcohol blood concentration level of 0.04 or more, which is a little bit lower because I think in the state of Michigan it's like 0.06. So it's pretty low. And yeah, basically you can't go flying whether you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And you also can't transport somebody who you know is intoxicated unless they're under the proper physical care. So part 91.103. Each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. This information must include, for a flight under IFR, or a flight not in the vicinity of an airport, weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternatives available if the planned flight cannot be completed, and any known traffic delays, of which the pilot in command has been advised by ATC. For any flight, runway lengths at an airport intended use, and the following takeoff landing distance information. Takeoff, landing distance, calculations, and performance. So this requirement is basically you have to understand everything that you're going to have to encounter during the flight. This goes for weather. This goes for calculating your fuel burn, any alternative airports. So you just have to be familiar with what you're going to be doing, where you're going to be going, what your options are if things go wrong. A lot of times some of this stuff is computed by like ForeFlight or other flight apps or electronics, but you still have to get this information somehow. And we kind of talked about how you get the weather reports and stuff in our last section on weather. As far as the other stuff, we'll talk about how you get that information in other sections. This is when we get to calculating flight performance. Section 91.105. During takeoff and landing and while en route, each required flight crew member shall be at the crew member station, keep the safety belt fastened while at a crew member station, and each required flight crew member shall during takeoff and landing, keep his or her shoulder harness fastened while at his or her assigned duty station, unless not equipped with a shoulder harness. This regulation basically is just saying that you have to have your seatbelt on while you are flying, and you have to have your shoulder harness on while you're taxiing, taking off, or landing. You can take that shoulder harness off while you're en route and during level flight, but for any other purposes, you have to have that shoulder harness on. Not all aircraft are equipped with shoulder harnesses. In fact, if you go and look at this regulation, you'll see there's a long list of different things that pertain to this. But the gist of it is you have to have a safety belt on while you're flying during any stage. That includes during taxi, takeoff, and landing, and you're required to have a shoulder harness if equipped during taxi, takeoff, and landing. Part 91.107. No pilot may cause to be moved on the surface, take off, or land unless the pilot in command of that aircraft ensures that each person on board has been notified to fasten his or her safety belt and, if installed, his or her shoulder harness. Each person on board must occupy an approved seat or berth with a safety belt and, if installed, shoulder harness properly secured about him or her during movement on the surface, takeoff, and landing, unless younger than 2 years and held by an adult following the above, using the floor given the person is on board for parachuting. So this is kind of an extension of the last rule, just saying that the pilot has to make sure that everybody knows how to use their safety belt. This is what's part of what's called the safety briefing that you must give passengers before a flight. And that pilot has to make sure that they're following those regulations, that they're fastening their seat belts and shoulder harnesses if equipped, and that person also has to be in a seat with a safety belt installed unless they're on board for parachuting or they're younger than 2 years old and being held by an adult. Part 91.111. No person may operate an aircraft so close to another aircraft as to create a collision hazard. No person may operate an aircraft in formation flight except by arrangement with the pilot in command of each aircraft in formation. And no person may operate an aircraft carrying passengers for hire in formation flight. This regulation is specifically talking about formation flight. And as a student pilot, you are not allowed to do any type of formation flying. As a private pilot, you are allowed as long as you fulfill the requirements here. So basically, you just have to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. You're not carrying passengers, and you're not doing it for hire except in some specific instances. I think there's some caveats to that rule. You also have to make sure that all the pilots in command of those aircraft know what's going on. Part 91.113. Aircraft have right-of-way in the following. An aircraft in distress has the right-of-way of all other aircraft. Converging aircraft, and they have right-of-way rules further. So aircraft to the other's right has the right-of-way, and that's subject to the maneuverability rules. So that goes balloon, glider, airship, and then engine driven. So a good way to remember this is aircraft that are more highly maneuverable have less right of way, and aircraft that are less maneuverable have more right of way. So obviously a balloon is a lot less maneuverable than a glider, and a glider having no engine is more it's not less maneuverable than an airship, but at least an airship's not going to crash if it doesn't land. So balloon, no engine, no propulsion. A glider, no propulsion, but highly maneuverable. Airship, probably can stay up for a long time, but it's not very maneuverable. And then all other engine-driven aircraft. So converging aircraft always give way to the aircraft on the right, in the order of maneuverability. So maneuverability takes precedence over that. But yeah, this is kind of a harder regulation, but just know aircraft to the right has right of way. Also, it'd be helpful to know the maneuverability rules as well. Overtaking. So when you're overtaking an aircraft, you have to alter course to the right and pass well clear. So just make sure that when you're overtaking an aircraft, you go wide around them and not to make a collision as referenced by the last regulation. If you're approaching head-on, both aircraft should alter course to the right. So if you can see that you're approaching head-on, sometimes it's hard to see that. Just go to the right and make sure that you're well clear of each other. When you're landing, the aircraft on final has right of way. You cannot use this regulation to force an aircraft off the runway, however. So if an aircraft is on the runway, it has precedence over somebody that's on final. You can't go on to final and be like, I have right of way. You have to get off the runway. That's not how it works. So any aircraft that's on the runway has right of way over you, and you have to wait unless you're in an emergency. Then, of course, this doesn't matter. An aircraft at a lower altitude has the right of way. Again, this is not to be abused, so you can't just go down to a lower altitude so that you have right of way to land. If you're on final and you're behind somebody at a higher altitude, and so you want to get in front of them, so you go down to a lower altitude. That's not how this rule works. So the person who's closer to the runway would be obviously still the right of way. So yeah, don't abuse the regulations. 91.115. Aircraft have right of way on water in the following: crossing, the aircraft or vessel to the other's right has the right of way. When you're head on, both should alter course to the right. When you're overtaking, the overtaking aircraft or vessel should alter course and keep well clear. So this is kind of like the last one. When you're crossing paths, the vessel on the right has the right of way, or the aircraft on the right has right of way. When you're head on, both should go to the right. And when you're overtaking, just make sure that you're clear of the other vessel. 91.117. Unless otherwise authorized by the administrator, no person may operate an aircraft below 10,000 feet mean sea level at an indicated airspeed of more than 250 knots. Not operate above 200 knots when below 2,500 feet above surface, within 4 nautical miles of Class C or D airspace, underlying Class B airspace, or within a VFR corridor through Class B airspace. Restrictions do not apply if minimum safe airspeed is greater than the max speed specified in this section. This regulation is the speed limit section. So when you're below 10,000 feet, you cannot go faster than 250 knots. This applies to all aircraft unless that aircraft can't go below 250 knots. Then you go to whatever your minimum safe speed is. This other part kind of applies to certain specific airspaces. So below 2,500 feet, in conjunction with, you have to be close to an airport that's Class C or D. So when you're within that ring, you cannot be faster than 200 knots. And we'll kind of talk about Class C and D airspace and what this means when we get to charts. And I'll probably bring this up again because it's kind of hard to visualize. Just kind of understand the premise of this. You cannot go faster than 200 knots when you're underneath of Class B airspace, or when you're within a VFR corridor through Class B airspace. And VFR corridors exist. They basically go through Class B airspace, so busy airports, and they allow smaller aircraft to pass through uninterrupted, so you don't have to mess with all the Class B stuff in the big jets. So they're kind of like a safe passage through bigger airspace. All right, 91-119. Except for takeoff, landing, no person may operate an aircraft below the following altitudes: an altitude such that if an engine were to quit, an emergency landing could be made without undue hazard to persons or property at the surface. Over congested areas, 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet of the aircraft. Over non-congested areas, an altitude of 500 feet above the surface, or over water, sparsely populated areas, no closer than 500 feet to any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure. So these are the minimum safe altitudes that you are required to maintain. So you have to at least be high enough that you can make an emergency landing safely. You have to be at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a 2,000-foot radius if you're like over a city or that kind of area. In fact, on aeronautical charts, congested areas are like considered, there's like yellow parts around cities and stuff, and that's kind of like considered congested. If it's not highlighted like that, then we consider it non-congested, and you just have to maintain 500 feet above the surface. And then over anything that's not considered to be populated, this would be like most of the UP, you have to at least be 500 feet above any person, vessel, or structure. All right, part 91, 121. Each person operating an aircraft shall maintain their cruising altitude, a flight level, or a flight level of that aircraft, as the case may be by reference to an altimeter that is set when operating below 18,000 feet mean sea level to the current reported altimeter setting of a station along the route and within 100 nautical miles of the aircraft. If there is no station within the area prescribed in paragraph A1I of this section, the current reported altimeter setting of an appropriate available station, or in the case of an aircraft not equipped with a radio, the elevation of the departure airport, or an appropriate altimeter setting available before departure. So to boil this down, if you're above 18,000 feet, you actually set your altimeter to 29.92 standard pressure. Everybody sets it to that. That way it's not based on like random curvatures of the earth or like little peaks and stuff. Everybody sets it to 29.92. Everybody's on the same page. Below 18,000 feet, you set it to the nearest airport, or you set it to an airport that you departed from and you knew the elevation at. So if you're at a certain airport and you know the elevation, you can dial that into your altimeter, or you get the elevation from, or the current altimeter setting from a METAR or some other weather source. Is basically all it's saying. All right. I think this will be our last one. So 91.123. When an ATC clearance has been obtained, no pilot in command may deviate from that clearance unless an amended clearance is obtained and an emergency exists, or the deviation is response to a traffic alert and collision avoidance system resolution advisory, or when a pilot is uncertain of an ATC clearance, that pilot shall immediately request clarification from ATC. Except in emergency, no person may operate an aircraft contrary to an ATC instruction in an area in which an air traffic control is exercised. If a pilot reacts to a TCAS alert, they shall notify ATC as soon as possible. If you deviate due to an emergency, you may be required to submit a detailed report within 48 hours if requested. So this regulation basically says that you have to obey ATC. The only kind of caveat to that is, of course, 91.3, which is in the case of an emergency, in which case you also might be required to submit a report. So if there is an emergency, a TCAS alert, which is a warning given out by a computer in the aircraft, you are required to obey TCAS alerts, even if it goes against ATC. Because the TCAS system, the way it works, communicates with the other aircraft. And so you don't do the same thing and end up crashing into each other anyway. And of course, in emergency, you can deviate, but if there's no emergency that exists, no TCAS alerts, anything like that, you have to obey ATC and all the regulations. All right, I'm going to